Good morning and welcome to our second live broadcast in the current events. I'm Bruce Cooper, the Chief Executive Partner of Clayton News. I'm happy to be here today with Adam Creighton, who's the Economics Editor for The Australian. Adam, an award-winning journalist, worked overseas both for The Economist and the Wall Street Journal. Clearly a man who knows and has his finger on the pulse of what's driving the Australian economy. He's worked in government, was a economics advisor to Tony Abbott when he was in opposition. He's also published with Oxford University Press, so he's got a pretty broad view of A, what's happening in Australia, and B, how Australia fits into the rest of the world. And thank you, Adam, for giving up your time today. We're grateful.
Thanks, Bruce. Thanks for having me.
Indeed. And for me, I mean, this is just such an open door question for you, so feel free to charge straight through it. And just to talk generally about the severity of the impact on the Oz economy arising over the last 5 months or 6 months.
Well, look, extremely severe, and we're going to find out actually just how severe in a few hours' time, of course, when the national accounts come out at 11:30. And there's never been so much uncertainty actually about that figure. So Bill Evans said this week in his career he'd never been so uncertain about what this figure was going to show. Indeed, just this week, everyone thought the company profits, which are released a few days earlier, would have actually fallen, but they went up by 15% because of the weird way the stimulus has worked, the way JobKeeper is treated. But nevertheless, the consensus expectation is down 6% for the quarter, which has never happened in Australian history. It's certainly never happened since the national accounts became quarterly in 1959, and it's probably the biggest contraction that's ever existed over 3 months.
Yes.
But I think, the real severity of the recession, I think, is seen through the labour market, because that's actually people's lives. GDP, I've argued for years, very abstract. No one really knows what it is, including most economics journalists. But the job market, you've got 30% of the labour market now on some sort of payment, right, which is just extraordinary. I mean, if you had have said that 12 months ago, no one would have believed you. 3.5 million people on JobKeeper, an extra 1.5 million on JobKeeper. And these payments are going to end. I mean, I've been kind of calling this a recession, and it certainly will be a technical recession, a phony recession, right? Because at the moment all these people are on payments. 1 million of them roughly are getting paid more than they were before. Yes. And in many cases, people are working less. So for some people, this is quite a nice time, especially all the work from home as well. Yeah. The government, of course, is racking up enormous debt, right, to sustain all this. But in October, there's going to be a massive drop in the flow of these stimulus payments, right, as JobKeeper starts to unwind, and then there'll be a further massive drop in January. Now, when those drops occur, I think you're going to see the real recession, because a lot of these jobs are not going to be viable, and people will be formally laid off. They won't have the same income as they did before. So I think that's when you're going to see the real severity of this recession. I don't think we're seeing it now, because the government, as I said, is borrowing at an enormous rate, but that's going to have to end. Yes. So look, the figures are very severe when you look at them, but I think the actual feeling of the recession is going to come in 3 to 6 months' time more. That's when I think. Yes. And maybe then people's views on the response to the virus might change a little bit. Yes. At least that's what I was saying. Look, to be more optimistic, some optimistic points are that this is a very unusual recession. It's the first recession probably in world history that has been caused by government restriction. Right? Normally recessions are caused by the ebb and flow of the business cycle. That's definitely not happened this time. And so we might therefore conclude that just as the economy was shut down by the government, it can be turned back on again by the government. Now, we don't know for sure whether it can be. It's still early days. But look, if you wanted to be very optimistic, it might be that in 12 months' time, the unemployment rate does fall back fairly dramatically as everyone goes back to work. Certainly the case, household income, because of these payments, is actually being kept very high, and people can't spend. So there's going to be enormous pent-up demand to spend when things go back to normal. Look, I mean, I'm not so optimistic. I think it's going to be very hard to turn the economy back on. Yes. But nevertheless, that's some people will argue that's a positive attribute of the situation. Also, China for Australia is still growing very rapidly. It was the first into the pandemic, the first out of the pandemic, you could say. Certainly, the iron ore price has been extraordinarily high. The mining sector in Australia is still very strong. Mining investment strong. So that's the Australian dollar's even been creeping up in recent days at 74 cents. So So I guess you could say the rest of the world still has, still has confidence in the Australian economy.
Yes.
If the dollar was at 50 cents, I'd be a bit more concerned. But that's not the case. So I guess that's my broad overview of kind of where we are. As I say, we're not going to really know how bad it is until the end of the year.
Yes. So what I am going to offer anyone watching, there's an ability for you to ask questions as we're going along. So please feel free to tap out whatever questions are coming to your mind, and we'll attempt to run those into the conversation as well. But, Adam, what you're speaking about there is that, and I've heard this expression before, and we've heard it years ago, the two-speed economy. Now, it was a different two-speed economy years ago. Now we've got a serious two-speed economy. But that sense of one of those speeds was always about the export market and the world coming to Australia, China and what have you. But do we think that even though China's first out of the pandemic, China is still an interactive part of a global economy? What does the global economy then do if everyone's struggling with these same domestic issues of growth and how to come out of COVID? How does that then impact on us? And is that...
Well, hugely. I mean, just to go back to GDP again, I mean, global GDP shrank 0.1% in 2009, right? Which is, because normally GDP grows fairly strongly because the population of the world is growing, developing countries are growing pretty fast. So for it to fall at all is an extraordinary development. The forecast for the global economy, I think this year is about 5% contraction.
Yes.
So that is 50 times as large as the contraction in 2009.
Yes.
So again, if that is not able to be turned back on again, that's a serious problem. And you're quite right. I mean, all countries are going to be growing more slowly. They're not going to be requiring as much of Chinese exports as they were before. That, of course, flows on to us. So far, though, for whatever reason, China is still buying our iron ore in great quantity. So that would suggest that their economy is growing at least. But yeah, look, I mean, it's true. The global economy is going to contract by a large amount, and that will have a flow-on effect on us. But just remains to be seen how severe.
You mentioned it. It was interesting to hear. You mentioned that the government has been borrowing because the stimulus money, the support money, has to come from somewhere. I'm presuming, as a non-economist, as a person who tries to run his own personal finances, that at some point in time you stop borrowing, or you can't borrow. So then, does the government then turn to the magical asset recycling? Because they've got to raise cash somehow. So how does that start to play out if the borrowing limits of the government or the imposed borrowing limits start to cap out?
Yeah, well, look, just on the borrowing, certainly there's a lot of that going on right now. So I think state and federal government debt, I think, is forecast to be $1.5 trillion in total, kind of over the next couple of years. That's the level it's going to reach. Roughly doubling. I guess roughly doubling.
Yes.
Now that's from a relatively low base. So Australia was very fortunate kind of going into this. The federal and state government debt's relatively low as a share of GDP. So we've been able to increase our debt very significantly. There's been no increase in the interest cost of that. In fact, on the contrary, interest costs have been falling. And governments all around the world have been increasing their debt very dramatically. I think the increase over the next few years for the OECD, I think, is 20 percentage points of GDP, which is huge. I think the average is going, for your typical country in the G20, OECD is going from about 80% to 100% of GDP. Whereas I think Australia, even after all this, will be about 40, 50%, depending on how you measure it. So they can keep borrowing quite a lot. I mean, as for asset recycling, it was very successful when it was introduced in 2014 by Joe Hockey. I think there was a 15% Commonwealth top-up payment for states that sold assets on the provider that they reinvested in infrastructure. Will that happen again? Well, look, I mean, it hasn't been mentioned so far by state or federal government. Certainly some states have more things to sell than others. My understanding is that Queensland and Western Australia still own more of their public infrastructure than New South Wales and Victoria. So there's less to sell in the two big states. So it could perhaps work in Queensland and Western Australia to some extent. But I do see a growing tension between federal and state government because of this virus response. I think you're seeing more of it all the time, actually. And so in that environment, I just wonder, how much cooperation there's going to be between the Commonwealth and say the Queensland government, especially when they're from different political parties. I don't think the federal government will want to be seen to be helping, the government if they haven't been towing the line in other areas. We're already seeing Victoria some people are complaining that that state's getting a lot of JobKeeper payments, and the government there is not really kind of wearing the full cost of its decision to shut down its economy for so long.
Yes.
So what are the incentives? What are the incentives? What are the right incentives? So while I do think the asset recycling was a good program, was very successful, it's probably got less scope now to function, both because assets have already been sold, and secondly, because of these tensions that I've been talking about.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting observation, not so much an economics observation, but that at the start of COVID, there was that great sense of joining together, state and federal. It was a great dynamic. That does seem to have eroded somewhat. But I guess if we back then into the real macro position, which is borrowing's fine, but at some point you've got to pay it back. So what happens to that debt overhang, and what does that do on a projected basis for the economy and people?
Well, certainly the government, federal government, politicians, especially liberal persuasion, they like to talk about the need to pay the debt back. I don't think it's ever going to be paid back. It's just going to increase, and it's just going to sit there for a very long time.
Yes.
So the last time we had such a dramatic increase in debt was the Second World War.
Yes.
And that was never paid back, so to speak. It's just that the economy grew very rapidly after the war, so the debt shrunk, and it would just kind of roll off, basically.
Yes.
And the problem with that, though, now is that the population is not going to grow like it did after the Second World War, or at least you wouldn't think it is. In fact, the forecast population growth in the budget, which I think is optimistic, is the lowest growth rate since 1916.
Yes.
So we're going to go from 250,000 net overseas migration roughly every year to this year about 30,000.
Yeah, massive.
And some experts are actually saying it'll be zero, it'll shrink. Now, how many years that goes on for, we don't know. But certainly that's going to mean that growing GDP is going to be much, much harder. So that debt is going to sit there. The interest cost of the debt is actually not too bad because borrowing costs are just so low for Australia, for all Western countries. So it's not such a huge drain on the expense side of the budget every year. Now, of course, if there were a sudden increase in interest rates, that would be a big problem, right? Because we do have a lot of debt. Not quite sure where I was going with that.
Well, I think what you're saying is that don't think about this as the massive boulder about to fall on us.
Oh, that's right. Paying back the debt. That's right. So Menzies, for instance, never ran a single surplus in his 16 years as Prime Minister.
And yet it's become
I always say that to people and they're shocked.
Because it's become the big thing. The Liberal Party says.
That's right. It's become a thing. It's not a thing anywhere else in the world. No one talks about the federal budget in the US, really. And they have a lot more problems than we do with their budget. I mean, in fact, their deficit is roughly the same size as our whole economy.
Yes.
Actually. So the gap between the revenue and expenses at the federal level is roughly Australia's GDP.
Yes.
So it's kind of extraordinary. And they get away with it. Borrowing costs there are very low. I mean, this goes to, kind of real existential questions. When does this kind of stop?
Yes.
At some point, governments, they just can't keep, what is it, 100% of GDP? Is it 200% of GDP?
Yes.
At what point do people say, well, look, we're not going to get our money back?
Yes.
If we lend it?
Yes.
And at what point do investors think inflation's going to break out?
Yes.
And then, of course, they're not going to want to lend at such low rates.
Yes.
But economists for years now have been saying it's coming, and it hasn't. No inflation.
But it has, and it has dominated the debate. I guess we pop off to Brazil and Chile and Ecuador and the others who suffered those existential debt crises in the 70s and 80s and say,
that's true.
What happened?
Well, that's a good point, actually. I mean, there are countries in the world where there is inflation, where there are these problems. It's just that we're part of the world where it's not.
Yes.
It's basically advanced countries. And I'm sure if you ask central bankers, they would say, well, that's because we have independent central banks and the public knows, investors know that we're in control. But, you do wonder, now that rates are at zero, formal rates are at zero everywhere, I think you're seeing treasuries around the world take more control of their central banks, whether that's formal or not. It's just inevitable. And after all, they're owned, but, they are the government. Central banks, we've got to have this fiction that they're separate, but they are, they're government agencies. Now, I think maybe if that goes too far, you might see more scepticism from investors and indeed the public about the reliability of the currency.
Yes. There's actually a question on the board, and it's a simple but an important one. Who is the government borrowing from?
No, look, it is a very good question. And, partly they're getting, they're being funded by the central bank at the moment. The Reserve Bank said yesterday that they've bought, I think, $61 billion of federal and state government debt in March.
Yes.
Which is, basically being purchased from newly created money, right? So the RBA's balance sheet is growing.
Yep.
This is it sounds a bit scary to some people, but this is what central banks have been doing all around the world now for some time.
Yes.
But that said, and to answer this more specifically, our bonds are still very, very popular with overseas investors. So
Yes.
the government's not having any trouble selling them, basically. And of all of the central banks, I understand, in the Western world right now, our central bank has had to do the least of this purchasing, if you like.
Yes.
So, for instance, in New Zealand, the Reserve Bank in New Zealand, they've had to do a lot more. Yes. And I guess you could maybe interpret from that they would struggle more to sell those bonds on the open market.
Yes.
If the Reserve Bank in New Zealand was not doing the buying of the government debt. But that's not the case in Australia. So that's a good sign. It's a vote of confidence in Australia.
Yes.
Like I said earlier, the currency's been going up. That's also a sign there's a vote of confidence in Australia. So we are actually borrowing from, real people, basically, real institutions. I mean, the Japanese historically have loved our government debt. The pension funds, I assume they are still big pensions.
Yes, yeah. And I guess ultimately, as happened back in the GFC, there was always those questions on American debt, who was buying it and who actually held some controls over where that currency was going.
Well, of course, the Chinese government had plenty of that.
Indeed, the one who mentioned.
Yes,
but
exactly.
Absolutely is the
exactly.
case. But Australia, from that borrowing offshore, a more balanced approach, we're more attractive to more Chinese will obviously be a buyer, but you mentioned the Japanese as well. I assume that there's a bit of a broad European...
I think the Japanese are still the biggest buyers, I understand, but it's hard to know because only 16 banks can actually buy the debt in the first instance, and you kind of don't really know who they on-sell it to.
Yes, who they trade it off to.
It's kind of hard to know. So it's actually hard to know in real time, I think, kind of who owns this debt.
Yes. But there's that expression too that I think you sort of alluded to, that quantitative easing.
Yes.
So maybe we talk to people about exactly what that means as well in the current.
Yeah, well, look, that is kind of what we talked about earlier, just without using the phrase.
Yeah,
so the RBA launched a quantitative easing program in March, although it didn't call it that. It's called yield control, which sounds like something in a car maybe that you do to me. But and you know what that is? Basically, they have promised that they will basically buy bonds to keep the yield on 3-year government debt at 0.25%.
Yes.
And they've actually succeeded remarkably well in doing this. They haven't actually had to buy many bonds. They've just said that they are willing to do it in unlimited quantities, and the market has just moved.
Yes.
I think it's a much cleverer way of doing it than what the European Central Bank, the Federal Reserve have done, where they have said, we're going to buy $100 billion a month. Basically,
and they
just do that.
Yep.
Whereas the RBA hasn't had to do that. So it's been able to keep its balance sheet a lot smaller than those other central banks.
Yes.
And just the knowledge in the market that it wants to keep it at 0.25 has been enough.
Yes.
So I think that's been a really smart move, and tribute actually to how the RBA has handled this whole crisis, I think, so far. I mean, things were pretty scary, by the way, back in March. I mean, I had some conversations with some senior people, and, the dollar was crashing, and it was hard to, people overseas were selling Australian government bonds in large quantities, and it was a scary time. But I think since then it's all been stabilised, and indeed there was a change of policy yesterday. The term funding facility was extended from $90 billion to $200 billion, which caught some people by surprise. I mean, just to muse on that briefly, it's kind of an interesting, I'm thinking, to what extent does this mean that the big four banks are kind of nationalised a little bit? Now, not, of course, not legally, but they have all this cheap money from the central bank, right, which is ultimately the government.
Yes.
So they are being propped up ultimately by the state.
Yes.
Kind of indirectly. What political power does that have over the banks? And to what extent are they able to operate like a private business now? I would say not very much.
Well, there's an interesting discussion for another day.
Just imagine when all these deferrals, kind of end. If there are lots of people going bankrupt and so forth.
I mean, somewhere there.
That's right, exactly. I mean, politically, can banks foreclose on all these people? I don't know.
Yes, I do remember in the GFC when Macquarie took great advantage of that government support, the banks, and Macquarie used that.
Yes, that's right.
For its own benefit.
They did right. That's very true.
If we turn them to that sort of onshore, offshore, those third reforms, the Foreign Investment Review Board reforms that came through, well, in fact, they weren't reforms, they were statements made at the start of COVID. There's to protect Australia's interests, we're going to reduce thresholds and we're going to control a little bit further. And then there's been that expectation that when COVID finishes, that will be released. We're an inbound investment destination. How much impact do you see that sort of government closer control and inbound investment having as far as the economy works its way through.
Yeah, well, look, I think ultimately it will have an effect on economic growth and our prosperity. You won't see it in the short term, of course, because all governments, as I understand it, are kind of doing things like this at the moment because they're very worried about their core assets being sold at at distressed prices. And let's be frank, our relations with China are not fantastic, and they have a lot of money still, and they would like to buy a lot of our assets.
Yes.
And I think basically the policy change was directed at them. I don't think the government's too concerned about a British firm or an American firm.
There's a sense that they weren't wasting a crisis because they could get something else done.
Yeah, but it is quite an extraordinary change, lowering the threshold to $0. So that means basically everything goes through the Treasurer's office now. That's quite an extraordinary increase in power for the Treasurer actually. Yes. Because it is a personal decision too. I understand the legislation basically just gives the Treasurer the right to make a decision.
Yes.
There's nothing to do with Parliament. Further only makes a recommendation. It's not binding. I think he's already rejected a few things actually, just in recent weeks.
Yes.
So yeah, look, that's all very nationalistic and great, but in the long run, as you point out, Australia has thrived on foreign capital coming in here, and you'd think we're going to still need it.
And yet you still say, and I go back to that comment earlier, which is all about confidence. So the dollar, where the dollar is sitting, is about confidence, and yet that government sort of hold back on further inbound capital doesn't seem to affect the dollar.
Not yet, that's right.
Well, exactly, not yet. So that sense of that offshore confidence in our ability to weather the economy is what's driving that sense of the dollar being in that right position.
Yeah, look, I think so. I mean, at a time of crisis, I think resources, sort of more critical, and we have a lot of those, and kind of always will.
Yes.
So I think that could be part of it. The gold price is soaring. We have a lot of gold. I mean, there's all sorts of factors. I mean, the central bank might not have a lot of gold in its vaults, but we certainly have a lot of gold as a country under the ground.
Yes.
So, which is much of the same, really. So, and we still have a lot going for us. Kind of in terms of our institutional structure. We speak English, all that sort of stuff. We're a rich country. We're in a growing part of the world.
Yeah.
So I think that's partly, and we haven't been affected by the virus anywhere near as much as Europe has, as the US has, and that's a wonderful thing. But it doesn't take off.
So it's that layering of the confidence levels of where that's going. I see we've got another question.
Sure.
Let me just read that one out. Do you see renewed impetus for Commonwealth and state financial relations reform to give states more power to raise revenue, so it relies less on those inefficient taxes? So the example being given, embracing income tax sharing arrangements and, here's one, and removing stamp duty. I can't imagine, even though that's talked about a lot, I can't imagine it'll ever happen on stamp duty.
That's right. Well, look, just on the stamp duty, I mean, full credit to the New South Wales Treasurer on this for really pushing this. For wanting to replace stamp duty with a land tax. I'm a huge fan of that policy, and as I think most economists are, the politics of it though is brutal.
Yes.
But the way the New South Wales has suggested that it might work, I think would fly, and that is when you buy a house, you choose whether you want to pay stamp duty up front or whether you want to pay an annual land tax.
Yes.
So what's wrong with choice? Most people, certainly I would choose the land tax rather than fork out tens of thousands of dollars for effectively nothing.
Yes.
And so over time, you would see all the properties basically shift from stamp duty properties to land tax properties. It would take many decades, but it's a start. As for Commonwealth federal relations, kind of in general, well, look, I would love to see the state have more independence financially, although actually maybe less so now, actually after this crisis. But anyway, that's another point. But certainly leading up to the crisis, I would have argued that it would be very nice if the expenditure of the states was broadly matched by revenue raising powers, because we do have this extraordinary discrepancy in this country. I think more than basically any other federation, where spending, so much of the spending is done at the state level, but the revenue raising not so much, which creates extraordinary complexity. Again, the New South Wales government in its reform paper has proposed to simplify dramatically the number of arrangements that stipulate how state governments are meant to spend money. And for instance, the whole health department, and especially the education department in Canberra, are largely kind of checking on what states do with money, which is kind of mindless, really. I mean, it does create a lot of jobs for the public sector. So if you're a cynic, it's got some purpose. But kind of looking at the health of the economy overall, it's not so great. But do I see any kind of income tax sharing arrangements? Well, basically no, I don't, because like I said earlier, there's going to be a lot more tension, I think, between the federal government and the state, and I don't think the federal government is going to want to give up its income tax powers, even if it theoretically makes sense. And I do think theoretically it makes sense, and there are various ways of doing it to incentivize states that if they grow their economies, they get more income tax.
Yes.
So you'd have to be very, very careful how you do it, but I don't see it on the horizon, sadly.
Interesting you use that reform, and to what extent does COVID and the current crisis allow governments to pursue a reform agenda to try and fix these sort of historical anachronisms, or is reform off the table because there's too many other things to think about?
Reform, yeah, it's we talk about reform a lot in Australia, I must say. And when I go overseas,
you look at me there and you're saying reform. It's such a big word.
Actually, some of my friends are asking me to write a joke, kind of reform column, about reform, because I think we just talk about it so much in this country, we don't actually do very much.
You got me on that one.
But no, but look, it's a good thing that we talk about it.
Yes.
And is this a burning platform? Well, look, it should be. It really should be. Whether it's land tax and stamp duty, I think, or superannuation.
Yep.
I'll certainly talk a bit about that. And I think that will, just on super, I think you might see some change. I think you will see governments being a bit emboldened because it knows that in this climate of a major recession, it's maybe more likely to get away politically with not increasing the superannuation guarantee, which of course deep down it does not want to do. Let's be clear, the Liberal Party does not want to increase the SG,
yes.
But they are very fearful, and rightly so, of the politics of not doing so.
Yes.
So I think you might see in the October budget, to the extent there is much kind of reform, and frankly I wouldn't even describe not increasing the SG as reform, but I think you might see a move not to increase it or to defer it or put it off for 10 years or something like that, which is actually a big change. I mean, what is the national wages bill? Like $1 trillion, so 2.5% of that is a lot. So that's a lot of money going to workers rather than going into funds. So it's a big change. But the more general reform, there's these 5 working groups looking at industrial relations. Well, let's hope that they come up with something that's agreeable, that will simplify the system a little, because I think the changing of our system so it's easier for firms to hire, you would think is going to be an imperative by this time next year, when there's still a lot of people out of work.
Yes.
And of course, tax, that is ultimately, the federal government's biggest kind of area, I guess, is the design of tax systems and the various kind of incentives that throws up. And I know they've got their 2024 reform of income tax, but really they should bring it forward. I've been arguing that they bring it forward to next year, kind of as soon as possible. The imperative to have a surplus, as we discussed, is basically fallen away. It's gone. So if it's gone, then who cares if it's a $40 billion deficit or a $50 billion deficit? Yes. Let's just bring the tax cuts forward.
Yes.
And enjoy the incentive effects of those.
Yes.
Rather than kind of wait 4 years.
Do you see, though, politicians are a bit of a different breed, and they do rely upon policy advisors, maybe, but do you see them embracing that and saying, actually, you're right, we're going to give away that sacred cow, we're going to just move forward now?
Well, look, are they going to have to? I mean, can they really go to the next election, the coalition, kind of talking about debt and deficit? I don't think so. Maybe, but it will just kind of look silly because they'll be presiding over what this financial year could well be a $200 billion deficit, which is just extraordinary, actually. They even say it. And remember, they were expecting a $4 billion surplus just a few months ago. So it's quite a turnaround. So what was a reform again? What
just about whether the reform agenda, and you covered tax and you covered super to a degree, it's whether those things which really press on the dollars available for investment by ordinary Australians, and whether they're going to be addressed by government as part of
the budget.
The budget.
Well, look, I think they'll talk about infrastructure, they'll talk about innovation. They love those words. But my understanding was that infrastructure spending was pretty high already going into this, and as we discussed earlier with the population issue, like there's going to be less need for infrastructure basically, because suddenly the million people that you're expecting literally over the next 4 or 5 years are not going to be there.
That's right. Yeah.
So, and the same with residential housing construction too. We just don't need as many homes anymore. So, and there's still a lot in the pipeline. A lot of apartments being built that are all going to come on deck over the next 6 months.
And that turns to another thing that certainly Sydney sides like to talk about, which is real estate. I'm going to sort of ask a real estate question. And that is this understanding now that work from home has accelerated what was changing slowly, but the massive acceleration over the last 5 months. And therefore, there's parts of the economy where you're going to have large spaces, whether it be retail or office space. How do you see that playing out on that sort of more micro?
No, it's a huge issue actually. The whole work from home thing. It's got so many dimensions. And just on the real estate front, I mean, you would think that it will put kind of downward pressure on the cost of both residential and especially commercial accommodation near the city, because it's just not so necessary anymore. And this actually affects me. My apartment's not too far from here. I'm a bit concerned about this phenomenon. Although that said, it doesn't seem to have happened yet. But and you would expect that you might see the prices of residential accommodation in nice regional areas or the outer suburbs go up because people don't need to be near the city so much. Certainly this has happened in New York. The rents and prices in Manhattan have absolutely collapsed in the past 6 months. And by the same note, prices have gone up in kind of neighbouring areas. A lot of people have moved up to Connecticut in the finance sector. They don't need to be in Manhattan anymore. So that is a very interesting phenomenon. The other thing about work from home that I find very interesting, and I've been working from home kind of on and off for kind of big swathes of the last 6 months, less so now. I've kind of been going in every day, not when I can, but is for white collar professionals, and that is kind of if they don't have children. I can imagine if you have small children running around, it can be actually very, very difficult working from home. But if you don't, then you could see the work from home thing as a massive pay rise per hour, right? Because your salary is fixed, right? And you don't have anyone looking at you anymore, basically. So you can be very efficient. You can do your work in fewer hours and maybe spend the morning at the beach. And some people are. In fact, I was on the harbour recently for my birthday. Someone took me out, and it was a weekday. And I said to my friend, his phone rang, and I said, oh, that was a work call, obviously. And he said, yeah, no, I'm working today. And I'm like, what? Are you working today? He's like, yeah, I didn't take leave. I'm like, well, that could not have happened in a previous a previous era.
No, he settled underneath.
That's
told
right.
everyone to be quiet while he was
That's right. And so what does that mean for our jobs when the boss can't see what you're doing? It's quite a profound question. What does that mean for your salary? What does it mean? And this is kind of a long-term phenomenon. And also, if the boss can't see you, then why hire someone in Australia? Why don't you hire someone much cheaper who's going to be on your Zoom call in India? So I'd be quite worried, I think, for a lot of white-collar professionals. It might be fun now, but over the next 5 to 10 years, if this thing continues, it's kind of where it's accepted that we can just be all in our pajamas at home, I think that'd be a very worrying phenomenon for a lot of kind of professional service industries where the work can be done remotely.
Well, it's interesting you raise that. I hadn't quite projected back out into what is, in effect, the service providers in low-cost countries coming into our space. But you're right. But what I have noticed from talking to people is that Australian government push, most governments pushed for regionalism, which in some parts has played out a bit, seems to be playing out now. The anecdotal stories that I'm hearing is that real estate agents in country New South Wales have never been busier because there's this push of people exiting town and having their bolt hole. So maybe this gets what the government always wanted, which is this push into regionalism.
That would be a good thing, I think. I mean, we've just seen, for decades, right, the proportion of the population in Sydney and Melbourne has just been growing. And this is a phenomenon in all rich countries. Big cities just get bigger and they suck people out of the region. Maybe this will start to reverse that. And in some ways, it's a transfer of wealth from the wealthy to the poorer, and that's a good thing. I think they'll be forced on anyone. It's just happening.
No, and there'll be challenges though then for regional infrastructure, because then that comes at cost. So you've got people out there. Whatever. There are every interesting thing will always have a challenge attached to it. I recently was at a BCA meeting, Business Council of Australia, and the BCA have been sort of pushing a bit of a line, but it has been suggesting that the government should be more proactive in choosing national industrial champions and saying, you need to identify what's going to lead us out of the darkness and be more proactive on that.
Look, I'm kind of naturally a little bit sceptical of this. And it's all very well to be hand-wavy and say we need to choose champions and all this, but when it gets down to the nitty-gritty of actually doing the choosing, an extraordinary amount of money can be wasted. And I think history would suggest that is that is generally what happens. But I think if we just get back to the fundamentals and try to lower our income taxes, by a significant amount, then we will attract foreign investment. I mean, I think we focus too much on the company tax rate, right? and to lowering that, and not enough on income tax rates. Because ultimately, if we want smart people and smart industries to move here, then we can't be taxing people at 49 cents in the dollar at $180,000. It's just not going to work. Like it's a very high tax rate, especially compared to our neighbours. And I don't see how we can attract the regional hubs of the world's big companies if we're going to tax their brightest workers like that. So I think we need to somehow shift away from income tax to other forms of taxes, and then then we will get the the industrial growth and the smart manufacturing and all of this stuff. I think by pumping government money into chosen companies or favoured industries, I think it's just going to be a recipe for waste. And look, I know it's worked in various Asian countries, and I don't have a good reason as to why it has.
Yes.
But I would say that in Western countries, it has not worked so well.
Yes.
And I don't think it would work very well in Australia either.
I guess, Adam, if you start thinking about it, you start thinking about the aggregation of you don't need to be in a place to work. You can get people from offshore to work with you. You can bring people in. And maybe there's some sense of all those things coming together, and perhaps that does become a bit of a, use that word again, reform agenda. But that idea of lowering personal income tax is a big hole that governments tend to...
Well, it is, and we've just ended up with such a huge reliance on income tax in this country compared to any other. I think probably we rely on it more than any other G20 country as a share of our income taxes collected.
Yes.
And it's been getting worse for many years. Bracket creep we've had now for 10 years. I know there's not been huge inflation, but over 10 years, that's quite a big increase. Yes. And actually, something I kind of pointed out many times in my columns was that even when these 2024 so-called tax cuts come in, the tax share will still be bigger than it was 10 years ago. So actually, taxes are still higher, even after the cut.
Yes.
Governments are very smart like that. They like to index. They like to say, oh look, there's a tax cut, but actually they've just indexed the thresholds a little bit.
Yes. Yes.
So I really do. One kind of great reform would be for every single year for those thresholds to be indexed to the rate of inflation.
Yes.
Which I think would be politically nice too, because every year someone would all get a small tax cut, basically, at least in nominal terms.
Yes.
But is that going to happen? Definitely not.
Vote one, Adam Creighton.
Yeah.
And we'll see what you can manage. Interesting that talk earlier about recession. There was always that expectation that recession was coming to Australia. The broad factors were pointing towards it, and now the COVID has produced it. You would have thought that perhaps there was that understanding that, what was it?
I think 28 years we got up to 28 years.
There's always that sense that it was going to come to an end, and COVID has just imposed the end on it sooner rather than later. You see the government being taken unawares by COVID, but they would have had these agendas lined up, I'm assuming.
Well, look, firstly, one of the silver linings, I think, of this recession is we don't have to hear about the 28 years of uninterrupted growth anymore. That is gone. Thank goodness, because both sides of politics loved it.
Yes. But they both claimed some...
Of course, that's right, exactly. We heard about it all the time. And actually, frankly, if you adjust it per capita, we've had 3 recessions over that period. So it's really only been that we've just had rapid population growth. That's the only reason why we had the 28 years.
Yes.
And as you're suggesting, kind of in the lead up, to this, it was actually very, very weak growth per capita, very weak. And that is just because we've just been relying on population growth, basically, and productivity growth has been really low.
But population growth is largely driven by immigration.
Oh, yeah, of course, absolutely. The fertility rate has been falling, and that's another
Exactly.
interesting thing about this recession. Generally in recession, you get fewer children, quite dramatically so, actually. At least that's the experience in previous recessions. So that will actually exacerbate the slowdown even further, because basically couples think they can't afford it, they don't have too many children, they're less happy, whatever the reason, there are fewer children.
Yes.
So that's something else to look out for. The interesting thing on the immigration is I think government, and indeed the opposition as well, they have become so obsessed with immigration as a way of boosting GDP growth. They will try extremely hard to get it to increase immigration once more. But I don't quite know how they're going to do that yet. Because obviously they've got this narrative now that we must defeat the virus. We can't have any virus in Australia. So I don't know how they can both have that narrative and also we need more migrants.
No, indeed.
So they don't agree with each other.
In effect, it's a delayed narrative because
exactly.
All that happens now, all that people look for now, I presume, is that golden cure, is that vaccine for the virus.
Vaccine, well,
anywhere between 6 to 9 months away.
I know. Well, it's so interesting how the narrative on this has changed too, actually. a month ago, most people were saying there won't be a vaccine, it's the nature of the virus, it's very unlikely. But now the government, at least here, is saying it's quite likely, and next year we'll have one.
Yeah.
I mean, I think politically, and I don't want to sound too cynical, but politically they need a vaccine, whether it works very well or not. Yeah. They need one. So they can say, vaccine is here, we can lift the restrictions, and they save face.
So you're going back to the confidence issue, which underpins most economic decisions. It's all about confidence.
No, look, that is true. And actually what I read in my column this week, I think is just about fear and how I think that's, fear of this virus, I would argue, and indeed I think I'm correct, is excessive for most people based on what statistics would say about the virus overseas. For most people, it's not really a serious threat. But if you ask them how much of a threat it is, they'll say very, very much, and they're very, very worried about their health.
Yes.
And government has helped this actually. And well, at least they've let it run right because it boosts compliance with public health measures when everyone's scared.
Yes.
But on the other side, if people stay scared for many, many months, they're not going to spend, they're not going to travel, they're not going to.
State of being.
It will basically become a state of being, and the economy will end up very, very weak. And so I kind of said, at what point does there have to be a public information campaign to tell people the truth about this virus, just to basically stop being scared?
Yes.
Because if people are still scared in 12 months' time, that's a disaster.
Yeah.
And certainly there was that survey in the UK and also Sweden where the typical person thought 5% of the country had died from the coronavirus. Millions of people.
Yes.
When it's far, far less than that. Far less. And indeed, if you ask people in various age brackets, they all have the same fear of the virus. Whereas, as we know, it's actually, the virus discriminates greatly, and it targets older people. So that is not a rational belief either.
Right.
So whether government is going to correct this belief or not, I don't know. But I think they might have to eventually.
Yes. Just drawing it back into New South Wales then, what role, New South Wales is still the powerhouse economy in Australia. What specifically do you see as the role of New South Wales in emerging from COVID, dealing with COVID, emerging from COVID?
Well, so far it's been absolutely critical, I would say, New South Wales, because, not only is it the biggest state, almost a third of the economy, I think, the national economy, it has resisted, I think, very admirably, extremely tough lockdown measures, which I think has been a great benefit to the whole country actually, because I think all the tax revenue that's generated here, which ultimately supports the rest of the country. The New South Wales government, I think, has been quite a reformist state government over the past 2 terms. I think it deserves a lot of credit for that. It's done a lot more, I think, than other state governments have. So I think, provided there's no lockdown here, and you never know, because, and actually what did kind of worry me was a survey in Victoria of people that showed people were very, very supportive of these very hard lockdown measures. And I just wonder that if there is an outbreak in New South Wales, say cases go to 100, they go to 500 or something like that.
Yes.
Which actually globally is not a lot, but by Australian standards, it's a lot.
Yes.
Would the state government kind of lock things down? And if that happened, that would be very bad for the economic outlook. Very bad, I would say.
Yes.
And we can't rule it out. But so far, hasn't happened.
So I'm going to go to maybe 3 or maybe 4 very self-interested personal questions for everybody, which I'm sure everyone's asking. So your view on my personal income taxes is that they should be reformed, they may not be?
Yeah. Well, no. So on that, I do think the government will bring forward some of it, some of its tax cuts. So there's a 2022 tranche and the 2024 tranche.
Yep.
I think the 2022 tranche, which is really just a fiddle, I would argue, it's not actually a huge cut. It's not a reform. Will be brought forward to the 1st of January next year. That would be my forecast, and that will be announced in the October budget.
Yes.
Whether the 2024 one is also brought forward, I don't think so, and I think it will be for political reasons because it gives a big tax cut to rich people, and I don't think the government wants to be seen to be doing that.
Yep.
So that's what I think will happen on the tax front. But as for broad kind of income tax reform, I sadly don't see that happen.
Okay, so some, but not what probably need. House prices for Sydney and New South Wales?
Yeah, well, look, they've been extremely resilient. So for the month of month of August, they fell 0.4%. That was the capital city fall. By average, they've fallen 4 months in a row, but only very, very steadily. If you go back to March, there were forecasts of huge falls in house prices, 25%, 30%. Simply hasn't happened. No. And in fact, Sydney and Melbourne are still 10% higher than they were 12 months ago. And it's quite a curious thing because rents have collapsed. I mean, I know that certainly in the eastern suburbs of Sydney, they've fallen by 20%, 25%. But the prices haven't fallen. And, why is that? This, standard economic theory would say if, your yield has just suddenly collapsed, then that's going to have some impact on the price. But it hasn't, and I think there's a safe as houses phenomenon going on. Yes. Also, the cost of borrowing has absolutely collapsed. You can get like a fixed loan now for 2% basically, which is extraordinary.
Yep.
And the people who are marginally setting the price of houses are not the ones who are losing their jobs. Right? So they're not your restaurant people, they're not your accommodation people, they're not people in their 20s and early 30s. They're not setting the price of houses. So long as the white collar professions are more or less okay, I think, and the borrowing costs have collapsed, I don't see a rout in house prices in Australia.
Right.
But I think they'll fall a little bit more, but not greatly.
It's not to the disaster levels. So that links into the next one, which of course everybody always asks about, is interest rates low and here to stay for quite some considerable time?
Well, I mean, you'd have to say, yes, I think they will be low for a very long time. But certainly that's what central banks all around the world are saying. But like I said, they ultimately aren't really in control of that. I mean, they like to think they are. It's just when there's a change in sentiment or the view of the future that the interest rates will change. And I think that will happen when there is an outbreak of inflation. There'll be a sudden and rapid change. And I think that could be quite catastrophic, actually, for the global economy. There's got all these governments with extraordinary amounts of debt, which is serviceable when rates are low. But even if they increase by 1 percentage point, governments like Italy and Spain, they cannot service those debts. Right? So they would default. And that would see the unraveling of the euro too, actually, which actually I think could be one medium-term casualty of all this. Because as the economy gets very, very bad in Europe, very bad, right? And I think it will as the various support payments go up. You're going to see a lot more populism in Spain, Italy, and Greece again, countries like that. And you never know, you might get a government in that says, look, we're going to have the lira back and we'll pay you back all these debts in lira instead of euro. Right? That would be a disaster for the euro and for lots of things. You certainly couldn't rule that out.
So that goes into the cohesion of the European Union, of course, and return to nationalism and national borders. Our inbound investors out of Europe are still dominated by Germany and the UK. So from our perspective, UK Brexit's already happened, Germany's still its own economy. So ultimately, they're not great for the world economy. As far as being selfish with us, we say, well...
Yeah, look, I don't think it's going to affect Australia too much. Just like I think this kind of much heralded the UK-Australia free trade agreement is really going to do that much because we're too far away and we just don't, we're not going to trade vastly more than we do now, even if it is free. So the interesting thing there is will both governments let their citizens work in the other country more easily? And that would actually be of real value to many Brits and many Australians. I suspect both countries will be too scared that their brightest people will leave, which is kind of ironic because they both have the same fear.
Well, it's interesting because we know now that the number of resumes we're getting from people in the UK wanting to come here has grown over the last 6 months. I think that perhaps is a COVID-driven thing, but one doesn't know. And then the other obvious, the personal economic question is when we're buying from Amazon.com, is our dollar going to be stronger or weaker, or 72.5, whatever it is at the moment, about the level that it should be?
Yeah, well, just on Amazon, I think I read this week that its stock market value is worth more than our entire stock market.
I read that.
So it's an extraordinarily large company. Look, I mean, I always hope for a stronger exchange rate, which is not what the official bureaucracy hopes for. They always want a weaker exchange rate because it supposedly spurs our exports. I'm a bit more skeptical. I think a weak exchange rate basically shows up that we're a poor country and that we can't buy sophisticated machinery from overseas. We can't upgrade our cars. We can't upgrade our fleets of planes. Although at the moment fleets of planes are not so relevant. But no, I think a strong. I mean, I'd like to see a dollar, kind of well into the 80s, where Australians can go overseas and not feel like a poor country. But when it's in the 50s and you go overseas, you feel very poor. And I don't think that's a long-term target for this country to have a really low exchange rate. But sadly, when I hear a lot of economists talk, that's almost as if that's what they want to see. Because maybe we'll export more. When actually the stuff we export is largely set in US dollars anyway. I would say in resource prices. So So I hope it's higher, but look, with the exchange rate, no one has any idea, and all of the economic theory, all of the empirical studies have shown that exchange rates are impossible to forecast.
Yes.
So I can't give you a good answer on that. Sorry.
So I don't know whether you should hold off on your Amazon.com purchases now or wait, but there you go. Always the way. So sort of to wrap up, sorry, there is a question. Unintended consequences of the policies, programs and projects that the government rolls out. That's a bit of a...
Are there any? Yes.
Are there any?
I would say a lot.
There must be.
Look, I mean, the JobKeeper, for instance. I mean, yes. Wow. I mean, there are so many unintended consequences. It's hard to know where to start. I mean, yes. People are going to quite enjoy being on this payment. I think, not having to work. As I said, 1 million people are actually getting paid more than they were.
Yes.
What does that mean for their desire to look for work? Ultimately, certainly at the moment, they wouldn't be looking for it at all because they'd just be quite happy to sit back.
Yes.
Businesses will get used to these payments, quite naturally as a subsidy for their staff, and then when they're taken away,
yes,
they will have adjusted their behaviour a little, which is the unintended consequence, and suddenly the job's not viable anymore.
Yes.
So my fear is with that program that you'll get big spikes in kind of formal unemployment when it's gradually withdrawn, yes, especially when it's completely gone by March next year. And the job seeker payment, which is basically the beefed up New Start. Look, I think New Start was always too low and should have been increased. But I think it's probably too high now. But there are questions about, if that is too high, then you'll get groups of people living together all on it, and they won't look for work. Especially young people, because you can have quite a nice life on three beefed up New Start allowances. I think at least I read some articles saying that was the case.
Yes.
I don't have first-hand experience, but yes, there are so many unintended consequences. There always are of government policy. Things sound good. The governments are well-meaning, but then they don't realise, kind of what it actually causes.
Yes. So, I'll give you another open door to wrap up. And I guess if we want to do that, and you probably touched on them already, but rebooting the Australian economy, if you had to pick the three biggest challenges or two or five, there might be 7 big challenges. What are the things that we need to start thinking about?
Well, the way to reboot it, I would say, and the number one thing is to extend this kind of early access to super policy, right? Which, yes, of course, the super industry hate. Right?
Yes, yes.
And they are the most powerful industry in the country, by far. And they're actually just right now swinging into gear into full propaganda mode to stop the delay in the increase of the SG. Yes. Because, quite naturally, they quite like another 2.5 percentage points of everyone's wages to manage. But, if you made that, as I've argued for many years, for instance, if the government said, look, we're going to make the compulsory SG a voluntary, right? So you can go to your boss if you want, and you can get a 10% pay rise. Right? That would be an extraordinary stimulus to the economy. Yes. Extraordinary. Right? Yes. I wouldn't necessarily let people withdraw the full amount from their accounts because that will all end up in the property market. House prices will go crazy and it would just be mad. But as a flow proposition, as a through time proposition, why not make it voluntary? I mean, as I've argued for years, a superannuation does not save the government money. Therefore, it does not save taxpayers' money. So therefore, taxes are much higher than they would otherwise be because of this policy. So you could make it voluntary, and you can actually also lower income taxes because you save some money. The concessions on super are about $36 billion every year, right? That's the foregone tax revenue. Yes. Right, and the savings on the age pension are estimated at about $7 or $8 billion a year. So you can see that there's an extraordinary difference, right? So if you could somehow, kind of get rid of the concessions and pay more in pension, you've got a lot of money that you could use for other things. Yes. And I would use that money 100% to cut income taxes. The government might not do that, but nevertheless, that would be my number one way to reboot the economy. And second would be, broader income tax reform, cutting those higher tax rates, but simplifying the system so there's only 2 or 3 rates rather than all these ridiculous business about Medicare levy and this and that. Yes. It's just so complicated. Yep. I think that would be good. And also on the industrial front, they've got to simplify the awards system, the so-called modern awards, which a friend of mine has been sending me some of the parts of these awards recently, and I'm just blown away by the complexity of these things. And it's incredible that there are any employees actually kind of hired fully strictly under these awards because they can't actually be compliant with all of the stuff. It's just incredibly complex. So I think that needs to be simplified too. So the industrial front, the tax front, and the super, making super voluntary, which I don't think will happen. But certainly if I was Prime Minister for the day, that's what I would do.
Right. So again, vote one, Adam. So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone from fertility at one stage to immigration through into tax reform, indirect tax reform as well. Just for me to say thank you for your candour. It's always interesting to talk to someone who sees a broader picture than what we do on a day-to-day basis, but can then bring it back down to, as we've discussed, New South Wales, we've discussed government and what have you. So from me, thank you very much. Thanks for your time. We're grateful. If there are no further questions, we'll let Adam get back and other people get back to their day job. Thanks again.
Bruce. Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.